History of Theater, Part 2, Unit 11. So looking at this timeline again, you can see we're picking up where we left off in the last history presentation at the end of the 1800s. We were fading out of the Romantic and melodramatic era into realism, and you can see there that Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest is there in 1895, which kind of blends the ideas of romanticism and melodrama, but in a more in-your-face and certainly heartfelt comedic type of way, because it's considered a farce, which we'll talk about in a bit, which takes realism into a more comedic element. And since realism was starting to really take hold, we're going to first look at Anton Chekhov, who you can see there at the bottom of the screen. He was starting to become famous at the end of the 19th century. He was Russian, and in Russia at this time, prior to communism, theater was taken extremely seriously and considered a science, much in line with the scientific revolution. Chekhov was a playwright, but also had studied medicine and came from a very prominent medical family. He believed that he needed to submerge life into his texts, which was very much like realism. And it was not always received well, due to the fact that some audiences just weren't ready for such issues to be presented right in front of them, as we've talked about before. He worked with the famous Moscow Art Theater and the famed director and actor Konstantin Stanislavski. His most famous plays were The Seagull, Three Sisters, Uncle Vanya, and The Cherry Orchard. And one interesting thing about Chekhov is that even though his plays seem very dramatic, and the characters are going through terrible times, he insisted that they were comedies. He often had characters who were so misguided or took themselves so seriously that he wanted us to find the humor in them. In a well-produced play of Chekhov's, there is indeed much comedy. Just to review realism one more time, it sought to reflect life, real life. It sought to have audiences understand their own struggles with the human condition, and it presented problem plays, or plays that present a real social issue and examine it, almost scientifically, from all angles and perspectives, and either come up with a solution or leave the audience talking amongst themselves about what is to be done or what should have been done. So then what happened? Well, artists and audiences are never content to just keep the status quo, and in fact, art often ends up rebelling against itself. This is a pattern that will prove to be repeated over and over again, even up until contemporary times. So we also have farce, which is a satirical and often goofy type of comedy. We have opera, that's been well established in the East and Europe already, but gives rise to the American musical. We have absurdism, or theater of the absurd, which is just what it sounds like. There's also other isms that come about in a term that we lump together as postmodernism, which means art that rebels and sometimes even considers itself anti-art. We also have specific social movements such as political theater, feminist theater, African American theater, and an overall category called performance art. So there's a whole lot of stuff to talk about in the 20th century that's all happening at the same time, pretty much. So first I'll talk a little bit about farce. Like I mentioned before, farce certainly has its roots even as far back as Roman comedies, back in the Greek and Roman times in the BC, 4th and 5th century BC, but in the 20th century, we were defining it for its contemporary audiences. Oscar Wilde really paved the way for British farce with The Importance of Being Earnest, which intended to make fun of the upper society. The rise of the middle class meant that they had more power to poke fun and expose the rich for their silly manners and extravagances. And that's a lot of what farce does, is it pokes fun at people's silly habits. So in contemporary farce, it's definitely comedic. It consists of unlikely, extravagant, and improbable situations. It uses disguise and mistaken identity often. It's fast-paced and characterized by physical humor, deliberate absurdity of nonsense, and broad stylization. And this may seem like a sharp contrast to realism, but remember, the middle class is rising up here and able to sit back a bit and relax into more comical and stress-releasing comedies that still have realistic, characters, but yet they're a little bit more fun to watch, as opposed to the urgent need for understanding the human condition that we saw in the realism movement. So hopefully you've been piecing together what a strong influence farce has had on our contemporary culture. Virtually every sitcom on television is strongly rooted in farce, and even though each decade has seen changes, the basic formulas remain fairly consistent. Another thing on our list of changes in the 20th century is the rise of musicals here in the 1920s. You can see on this timeline that television and film were also becoming quite popular, which also added to the competition and the need to define what is realistic. If a camera is right in front of your face, it's going to be a different acting style and a different kind of need than when you're in the stage, and that's a whole nother topic. So if you take a television or cinema class, you'll learn more about how these mediums all affected each other. But back to stage musicals, and particularly Showboat, which is listed there at the bottom, and it was first produced in 1927. A little bit more about Showboat. First of all, singing and dancing on stage was certainly nothing new, but putting a strong storyline to it with a dramatic arc was something that started developing quickly in the early 1900s. And by 1927, the musical Showboat won a Pulitzer Prize and was the first production to feature singing and dancing with a strong narrative storyline, realistic characters, and believable emotions. It was arguably the first serious musical with a strong beginning, middle, and end, although Oklahoma is often considered the quintessential American musical as well. Musicals in general were developed from follies, or dancing girls showing off, basically, and the format of opera, which has a strong narrative storyline. So you start blending those things together and you come up with the American musical. So let's think for a second about what was going on in society that affected all of these changes from the rigors of realism. There were two major world wars between 1915 and 1945, which had a profound effect not only on daily lives of people in Europe and in America, but on people's worldview and their trust in reality. Automobiles changed the landscape of America and how we sought out entertainment, and of course, the Great Depression in the late 20s and 30s, which left many people helpless, but not without the need for entertainment. People wanted to escape reality, such as they could find in musicals, and not necessarily be faced with the bleakness of realism. So you can see why these things started happening so differently. And of course, we have the rise of the middle class in the 1950s. This came with many changes. As Americans' prosperity increased, so did their need for understanding their new place in the world and the economy. We now have a return to some intimate realism plays such as Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, All My Sons, A View from the Bridge, all about America's changing economic and social structure and how that affects family life and reality. Then Tennessee Williams, who wrote Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, A Streetcar Named Desire, and The Glass Menagerie. A fascination with the Midwest and all that the American dream was supposed to be was shown in these plays. Then there's my favorite, absurdism. Alongside American drama, then Europe gave birth to theater of the absurd after World War I and World War II. They awoke, so to speak, to devastated lives after the two world wars and thought, wow, what was that all about? So the artists especially rejected realism because of this and sought to make sense of life on their own terms. So then we have three types of absurdism. Fatalist, which means we're trapped in an irrational universe where communication has broken down. Hilarious, which looked at the insanity of life in a comedic way. And existential, the philosophy that human beings are naturally alone and the absence of a God means that man must create his own existence, purpose, and meaning. So you can see how these art forms were in response to a world gone mad with such devastating war and destruction, and we're trying to make sense of it. Here's some fun images to demonstrate how we think of these terms now and how they have integrated themselves into our everyday world and our way of thinking about humor and art. Absurdism has its roots in Dadaism, which considered itself anti-art or doing whatever it takes to rebel against what society expects art to be. Playwrights of absurdism include Eugene Ionesco, who found language itself to be absurd and meaningless, so you can imagine how silly his plays are, and Samuel Beckett, who believed that life is what happens when we actually sit around and do nothing, because it's just going to happen anyway. And of course, Harold Pinter, who wrote the play you're reading, The Homecoming. So here we are now in the timeline, headed into the 1980s. Lots of things happening. So you can see Cirque du Soleil gets its start in 1984, and some major contemporary playwrights become prominent. David Mamet, August Wilson, Stephen Sondheim, who wrote a lot of musicals, Wendy Wasserstein, who's a feminist playwright, And this is the Reagan era, so economics are going to be a major point of some plays too. The American musical continued to thrive as it still does today. In the 80s, we saw the popularity of Cats, Annie, composer Stephen Sondheim, who wrote Sweeney Todd and Into the Woods. They were just getting started, and economically, the American drama continued to develop. Playwrights such as David Mamet, Sam Shepard were writing plays that reflected the economic and social class landscape. Feminist theater saw playwrights like Carol Churchill, Paula Vogel, Wendy Wasserstein, who were writing about women's issues and their place in society. And African American theater was brought forward by playwrights August Wilson and, of course, Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun. Here's some photos, and just looking at them side by side, you can see the variety that American theater was experiencing in this period, the mid to later 20th century. The first photo in the upper left corner is Glengarry Glen Ross by David Mamet about cutthroat real estate salesmen fighting for power, greed, and dominance. And next over is the popular musical Cats, which is one of the longest running musicals of all time. And then in the lower left is a play by August Wilson. Wilson set out to write about the African American experience in each decade of the 20th century. His stories take place chronologically. This photo here features Denzel Washington in Wilson's play Fences, which takes place in the 1950s and talks a lot about the African American experience in America. And in the lower right corner is Carol Churchill's Cloud Nine, which is not only a feminist issues play, but really takes the practice of postmodernism, or breaking the rules of realism, and by putting scenes out of order, doing scenes over again with different language, and really challenging the way we see and think about reality, which is a lot of what we're doing in the 20th century here. We're taking that realistic movement and we're kind of messing it up. So a lot of variety, and really there's something for everyone as we get closer to our own contemporary time period and contemporary aesthetics. So to summarize some main points of this presentation, we can say that theater reflects life, sometimes realistically for the purpose of understanding reality, and sometimes in a completely rebellious and opposite way for the purpose of escaping reality and then coming back to it with a new understanding. Both approaches are valid, necessary, and vital to our society. So in the next unit, we'll look even closer at what's happening now, keeping in mind that we gain perspective with time, so hopefully we can have a somewhat clear perspective of where we are and where we're headed in our own time. But by studying these patterns in history, we can at least learn from and honor what has come before us. And that's the end of this presentation.